Beneath the thunder of Rome's greatest arena, where victories were celebrated with deafening applause, one story survived only because Rome failed to erase it completely. A story of a young woman, of a broken people, and of a reward so disturbing that even Rome's proudest senators tried to bury it forever. Tonight, you'll hear the truth that slipped through the cracks of history. In the summer of 79 AD, deep beneath the Colosseum's roaring stands, a 19-year-old Dacian girl named Sabina stood chained in a cell swallowed by darkness. Above her, 50,000 Romans bellowed in triumph, celebrating the gladiator who had just murdered her brothers in the arena sand. Their cheering shook the stone above her like a second heartbeat. To the crowd, it was entertainment. To Sabina, it was the sound of her world ending. What happened to her in the next 3 hours would become one of Rome's most aggressively hidden rituals, an act so vicious that even Rome's own historians argued about whether recording it would tarnish the empire's image. Some wrote cautiously, others stayed silent. A few tried to destroy the evidence entirely. This is the story the Senate tried to wipe from the record, the reward that turned victorious gladiators into untouchable men behind locked doors, and the horror Rome disguised as tradition. But before we descend into the chambers where Sabina's fate was sealed, remember to tap the like button if you've ever wondered what truly happened after the crowds went home. And subscribe to Chronidex, because once you hear this, ancient Rome will never look the same to you again. Now, let's go back to the beginning, where this darkness was built stone by stone. The Colosseum had only just opened, its first full year of spectacle. To Romans, it was more than an arena. It was a monument to dominance, a mountain of marble swollen with pride. Its air was always thick with iron and sweat, mingled with the musky stench of exotic animals pacing in cages below. The sand on the arena floor wasn't decorative. It was a sponge, designed to drink the blood of men and beasts alike. Beneath that sand lay a maze of tunnels, pulleys, hooks, lifts, and cells. Some held lions, some held gladiators sharpening their blades. Others held people like Sabina, the condemned, the captured, and the conquered, Rome's human inventory. Gladiator combat was never just sport. It was political propaganda, religious ceremony, and psychological warfare bundled together. The message was simple. Rome decides who lives, who dies, and who entertains. 1 year before, in 78 AD, General Marcus Antonius crushed a Dacian uprising in the northern highlands. His return to Rome brought treasure, prisoners, and a parade of humiliation. Among the 847 captives were 124 noble women, chieftains' daughters, priestesses, warrioresses, and leaders. They were not common villagers. They were symbols, living proof that resistance against Rome was useless. Sabina was among them. Her dark highland hair, her pale skin, her posture, everything about her declared that she came from a proud lineage. Before Rome burned her village, she had been engaged to a warrior named Decebalus. Roman soldiers killed him 3 months prior. Now she stood in chains, her future erased, her dignity hanging by threads. While Sabina's world collapsed beneath the arena, another figure above her was rising to glory. His name was Gaius Valerius Maximus, 32 years old, broad-shouldered, nearly 6 feet tall, massive for his time. His body was a map of violence, old cuts, deep gashes, scars crossing scars. Each one represented a life he had taken, a crowd he had thrilled, a fight he had survived. Born a slave after his father died in a debtor's cell, Maximus had spent 14 years navigating the thin line between fame and death. He had killed 89 men in sanctioned combat. His dream was simple: earn the rudis, the wooden sword that granted freedom. His greatest fear was simple too: to die nameless, dragged away on a meat hook like so many forgotten fighters. But today, in front of Emperor Titus himself, Maximus defeated the Dacian champion. It was a victory that echoed across the empire. And, by tradition, his reward was more than money, more than wine, more than honor. It included first choice among the captivae, the female prisoners. Sabina didn't yet know it, but she was on that list, and Rome was about to show her and the world what imperial mercy truly meant. The hourly bell of the arena had barely faded when the machinery beneath the Colosseum began to move. Not the gears and pulleys, the people. The guards, the scribes, the handlers, the bureaucrats. The quiet orchestra behind Rome's cruelty. While Maximus received his laurel wreath above ground, the prisoners below were being transformed, not for freedom, but for display. Inside the women's holding chamber, Sabina and 17 other Don captives stood shoulder to shoulder, awaiting orders. The room smelled of damp limestone and fear. It always did. When the guards entered, they carried buckets of water, bundles of coarse fabric, and wax tablets used to record quality notes, as if the women were livestock being evaluated. A guard, bored, impatient, probably hungover, grabbed one woman by the wrist and pulled her into the center of the room. Without speaking, he poured water over her head. 2 attendants scrubbed her skin with rags rougher than sackcloth. They combed her hair so viciously that strands tore out at the roots. Sabina watched as each woman went through the same ritual: scrub, inspect, record, strip, replace. Their ripped clothes were removed and swapped for plain beige tunics. Simple, shapeless, deliberately stripping away cultural identity. Next to Sabina stood Zamaxis, an older woman, a priestess of the Don Sun Temple. Her wrists trembled, but her voice remained calm. She leaned toward Sabina and whispered the truth no Roman would ever tell them. "They aren't cleansing us," she murmured. "They're preparing us for the show, or for what comes after." Sabina didn't ask what after meant. Deep down, she already knew. And above them, unseen by the captives, a second preparation was underway, something far darker. Arena workers were constructing a new form of interlude entertainment, a theatrical humiliation designed to break the Don people publicly. It wasn't enough to kill warriors. Rome needed to erase their pride. At the 3rd hour, a herald's trumpet blasted. It was time. One by one, the Don women were chained together and walked toward the elevator platforms. These lifts, powered by teams of workers and engineered with Roman precision, were designed to make beasts, gladiators, and prisoners erupt from the floor of the Colosseum like magic tricks. Today, Sabina would be one of them. The lift rose. The doors opened. And Sabina stepped into a world made of sound. The roar of 50,000 spectators crashed into her like a wave. The heat from the sun and the baking sand hit her skin instantly. She smelled roasting meat from vendors, sweet perfume drifting from the elite seats, stale wine, sweat, and the metallic bite of blood darkening the ground. Every inch of the arena was designed to make conquered people feel smaller. The herald announced their supposed crimes in a booming voice: rebellion, treason, refusal to worship Roman gods. The crowd booed, threw scraps of bread, shouted insults in 3 different dialects. Then came the twist no one expected. The women would be forced to fight each other. Not with real weapons, but with wooden swords, props meant to humiliate, not empower. The winners would be claimed. The losers would be executed. The crowd ate this up. To them, it was comedy. Sabina felt the weight of the wooden sword in her hand. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't sharp. And that made it crueler, because Rome didn't want a real fight. Rome wanted a show. Across from her stood Chronicles, the sister of her fallen fiancé, a woman who had once braided Sabina's hair, taught her to weave, and sang at her engagement ceremony. Now Rome wanted them to destroy each other for amusement. Their eyes met, and in that silent moment, they decided the only thing they left could choose. They would not play this game. The master of games raised his arm to begin the match. He dropped it. The crowd roared, but both women stayed completely still. No stance, no swing, no fear in their eyes, only defiance. The audience, confused at first, grew furious. They started shouting insults louder. Olive pits and dirty food scraps rained down. A few men even hurled wine cups into the sand. Still, Sabina and Chronicles did not move. For 90 remarkable seconds, two unarmed young women refused to bow to the mightiest empire on earth. Rome hated defiance more than rebellion. Guards stormed in with swords drawn, flat side only, designed for punishment, not death. Death would be too merciful for defiance. Chronicles was struck from behind, collapsing to her knees. The crowd cheered the way they would cheer a lion bringing down prey. Sabina cried out and rushed to her, dropping her wooden sword. She didn't care if the guards saw her grief. She didn't care what came next. The two women were dragged from the arena, not toward the execution pits, but to something the spectators enjoyed almost as much: the champions' allocation chambers. Below the arena floor, a scribe recorded their fate on a bronze tablet. 20 captive females, Don origin, processed for post-victory distribution. 2 resisting, transferred for champion exclusive use. This wasn't improvisation. This wasn't chaos. This was procedure. Cold, structured, documented cruelty. Sabina and Chronicles were separated and taken to different rooms, small chambers lit by torches, with stone benches, iron rings for restraints, and doors that locked only from the outside. Everything about these rooms was designed with intention. They were part of the building, the way lion cages were. They weren't secrets. They were features. At the 4th hour, Gaius Valerius Maximus was escorted to Sabina's room. He entered still wearing the blood-spattered armor from his victory. She stood frozen in the corner. Between them stood the full weight of Roman law. He was legally entitled to her. She had no rights, no protection, no defense. History doesn't record Maximus's expression. No diary, no personal letter survives. All we know is this: he set his helmet down, placed his sword on the floor, and sat with his head in his hands. 5 minutes passed. 10. When he finally spoke, it wasn't in Latin. It was in broken Don. What was his name? Whose? She whispered. The man they made you watch die. Disbelief. Maximus let out a breath. I killed a man named Dalis today. Could have been family. Your people use the name often. What followed was not the assault Rome expected. It was a conversation. Two broken people sharing losses from opposite sides of a war neither of them chose. 2 hours passed. Guards checked twice, heard voices, and walked on, expecting the worst. But at 6 p.m., Gaius Valerius Maximus made a decision that would shake the arena system to its core. He walked to the door, opened it, and called for the guard. "This woman is sick. Infection. I refuse the allocation. Send her to the physician." It was the only loophole that allowed a gladiator to reject a prisoner. The guard knew he was lying, but Roman bureaucracy valued procedure over truth. Sabina was taken away, to the medical ward. And though Maximus had saved her from one horror, she would die 3 days later from a simple infection in overcrowded, filthy conditions. Rome didn't care. Rome didn't record her name. Rome moved on. And everything that happened next, the rebellion Maximus inspired, the Senate debate, the law that changed Roman entertainment forever, began with that moment of unexpected mercy. The morning after Sabina's transfer to the infirmary, the Colosseum's underground halls felt strangely tense, like the air held its breath. Word traveled fast in these corridors, faster than orders, faster than truth. By sunrise, every gladiator, guard, scribe, and torchboy had heard the same whispered phrase: Maximus refused his reward. It didn't make sense. Champions never refused, not because they were monsters, though some were, but because refusal meant one thing: you were insulting the system that kept you alive. And Rome despised being insulted. High above the arena floor, in the marble silence of the administrative wing, 3 men gathered in a chamber lined with scrolls and bronze tablets, records of every spectacle held that year. Behind them, the faint roar of the city spilled through the open windows. At the center sat Aulus Petronius Falco, senior curator of the games, a man who believed deeply in appearances because he knew they were the only thing keeping the arena profitable. He tapped a wax tablet with the edge of his stylus. "This cannot happen again," Falco said, controlling his voice, though the vein in his temple throbbed. "Gladiators accept their allocations. They always have. If we allow them to refuse, we signal weakness." The man to his right, Cassius Longinus, chief scribe, leaned forward. "With respect, sir, the girl was Daean. The crowd hates the Daean. They'll forget her by tomorrow." Falco stared at him with an exhaustion only experienced by men who manage powerful illusions. "You don't understand. The crowd doesn't matter. The Senate does, and we cannot let them smell scandal." The third man, Tribune Nero Varro, scoffed. "What scandal? A champion didn't want his prize. Perhaps he prefers men. Who cares?" Falco set the stylus down. "You've misunderstood the situation entirely. The problem isn't the refusal. It's why." He continued, voice low. "A physician reported that Maximus had the girl moved to the infirmary, not the holding cells. He stayed with her for hours. He spoke to her in her own language." Falco fixed both men with a hard stare. "That is not lust. That is sympathy." The word was dangerous, treasonous even. Roman entertainment could stomach cruelty, excess, even madness, but not empathy. Empathy made people question the system, and questioning the system was poison. Below ground, Maximus sat alone in his cell, staring at the sand that still clung to his boots. He had washed the blood from his hands, but Sabina's story stayed under his nails like something that refused to be scrubbed clean. The other fighters watched him from their doorways, some with confusion, some with quiet awe, some with fear, because Maximus had broken a rule older than any of them. By midday, a guard arrived with new orders. "Maximus, report to the Senate Commission, immediately." No champion had been summoned to the Senate in decades, not unless it was to receive a public award or a political execution. He stood, placed his wrists forward for the shackles, and followed the guard up the winding stone stairs, through the private corridors, and into the blinding sunlight of the upper colonnade. The Senate Hall towered above him, a mountain of marble and arrogance. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with incense and impatience. Senators sat in semicircular rows in white togas, gold rings glinting like the eyes of predators assessing prey. When Maximus entered, they looked at him not as a hero, not as a man, but as a tool, one that had malfunctioned. The presiding senator, Gnaeus Calpurnius Regulus, began. "Gaius Valerius Maximus, you stand before the Senate to answer a simple question. Why did you refuse your allocation?" Maximus didn't kneel, didn't bow, didn't flinch. He simply said, "Because she was a human being." The chamber erupted, hissing, shouting, fists slamming on benches. Regulus raised a hand for silence. "You speak as if we treat these natives unfairly." Maximus met his eyes. "You do." A sharp inhale cut through the room. No gladiator had ever spoken to a senator like that. Regulus leaned forward. "The games keep the people content. The people demand spectacle. They demand consequence. Mercy." He paused, choosing the word like a man choosing poison. "Is not a virtue Rome rewards." Maximus replied softly, "Then Rome rewards the wrong things." The senators erupted again, half enraged, half intrigued. Regulus whispered something to an aide before delivering the final blow. "Very well, Maximus. The Senate will consider your insights." The way he said it made Maximus's stomach drop. Insights meant nothing. Insights were dangerous. Insights needed to be buried, and someone would have to pay for them. That evening, after Maximus was escorted back to his cell, a courier burst into the administrative wing with trembling hands. Sabina had died 3 hours earlier. Falco closed his eyes. Of course she had. Of course this would happen now. He dismissed the courier and turned to Tribune Varro. "Destroy her medical report. Burn her intake record. Remove her name from the captivity log. From this moment on," he paused, calming his breath, "she never existed." Varro nodded once, grabbed the documents, and walked toward the brazier. Falco whispered to himself, "The games must remain pure. Rome must remain unquestioned." He believed it, or tried to. But Maximus had seen something he could not unsee. And one man refusing to play the game was enough to unravel the entire illusion. Because if a champion could question the system, what stopped the crowd from doing the same? The morning after Sabina's death, the Colosseum felt strangely hollow, even under the roar of gladiators warming for the next match. Beneath the marble and sunlight, the underground chambers buzzed with whispered panic. The bureaucrats, scribes, and overseers knew something dangerous had happened. One gladiator had refused his reward. One girl had died. And the Senate, the guardians of Roman order, were about to face a problem they could not ignore. In the heart of Rome, in the marble-clad Senate Hall, the first stirrings of scandal began to creep through the city like smoke before a fire. Senators who had long relied on the spectacle to maintain control now whispered about the incident of the Dacian women. It was a phrase so sanitized it almost erased the horror of reality. Yet every whisper carried the weight of truth that Rome's proud leaders could not allow to circulate. Senator Quintus Aurelius Semachus, a man with hair prematurely grayed by years of political warfare, stood before his colleagues. His voice, though calm, carried an edge sharper than any sword. "Gentlemen, we face a question not of entertainment, but of authority. The games have always served Rome, yet today we see a gladiator refuse a reward, and in doing so undermine every custom that has kept this empire in submission." He let the words hang like smoke in the chamber. The senators shifted uneasily in their togas. Many feared Maximus. Others feared what the people might think if whispers reached the streets. And a few, secretly, feared the truth itself. Outside, in the narrow alleyways of the Forum, word had already spread among freedmen, merchants, and slaves. Maximus's act, small, silent, human, had become a story. Not one recorded in official scrolls, but carried in whispers, muttered over market stalls, and shared behind the thick wooden doors of the taverns. The idea that a gladiator, a man whose life was measured in the screams of spectators, had exercised mercy, it was almost unimaginable. Back beneath the Colosseum, in the underground chambers, Maximus walked slowly past the cages. His shadow stretched along the stone walls, moving over iron rings and water channels carved into the floors. Each chamber told a story of cruelty perfected, human suffering catalogued like livestock. Sabina's absence now echoed in every corner. No one spoke her name aloud. That was Rome's way. If you never say it, it never existed. Yet one observer refused silence. A young clerk, barely 17, who had been tasked with recording the allocation of captives, noticed the discrepancy. In the ledger, beside Sabina's name, he wrote the words, almost unconsciously, "Removed by gladiator request, died in infirmary." It was the only acknowledgment of her humanity left in the empire's records, and someone, someday, might read it. The Senate met again in secret. Behind polished columns and the muted scent of incense, the discussion was heated. Conservative senators argued tradition. The empire had always exercised its authority over the conquered. Slavery, captivity, allocation, these were immutable laws. Public scrutiny would not matter. The people would obey. But a reformist faction, small but growing in influence, argued differently. They warned that the empire's method of control might be eroding. Reports from the provinces told a dangerous story. Families in conquered territories were no longer intimidated. They were enraged. Tales of the Dacian women, of a gladiator refusing his reward, spread like wildfire, sowing the seeds of defiance. In this charged atmosphere, a compromise was proposed. It was thin, almost meaningless, yet symbolically important. On October 1st, 79 AD, the Senate passed the law that would quietly change the rules. Female prisoners of war could no longer be distributed as public rewards in the arena. Public humiliation was banned. Private exploitation remained, hidden in shadow. But the spectacle, the theater of domination, had an official limit. Rome smiled at the compromise. They had acted. Order was restored. The empire could still kill, still conquer, but now there was an invisible line. Meanwhile, Maximus, walking among the corridors of the Hypogeum, felt the weight of what he had done. He had broken the unspoken contract. And though the law seemed a victory for humanity, he knew its effect was almost meaningless. For every Sabina, for every Camacicus, Countless others had already suffered and would continue to suffer behind locked doors. His mercy was a single flicker of light in an ocean of darkness, but even one flicker was dangerous. Stories of Maximus's refusal began to circulate among gladiators like a forbidden gospel. Whispers became tales, tales became legends. Young fighters told each other of a man who had defied tradition, who had recognized a human being even when the empire commanded otherwise. It was a dangerous precedent. And Rome, with its obsession for order and spectacle, knew it. The Senate could pass laws. Guards could enforce them. The arena could operate under stricter rules. But ideas, once spoken, could not be contained. And for the first time, Rome faced the terrifying realization that human empathy, unexpected, small, persistent, might be harder to conquer than armies, harder to control than gladiators, and more contagious than fear. The months following the Senate's decree passed like a muted drumbeat through the streets of Rome. Publicly, the empire appeared unchanged. Gladiator games roared, triumphs paraded, and the marble halls of power continued to shine. But beneath that polished surface, a subtle tremor spread, one that the most powerful men in Rome could neither ignore nor erase. Gaius Valerius Maximus returned to the arena after his infamous act of defiance. The crowd cheered, unaware of the storm that had erupted behind closed doors. For Maximus, each fight became a test, not just of skill, but of conscience. He refused his reward multiple times, shocking fellow gladiators and provoking whispered debates among arena officials. Rome's machinery of cruelty, perfected over decades, had never encountered a variable it could not immediately control. Yet Maximus, once a tool of the empire, now exercised choice. In the provinces, the story spread. Traders in Gaul, soldiers in Hispania, and slaves in Alexandria all repeated fragments of the tale. A gladiator who refused a woman for reward. A single act of humanity against centuries of systematic cruelty. It became legend before it was fact, shaping perceptions of power, mercy, and the limits of Rome's authority. Back in the hypogeum beneath the Colosseum, Sabina's absence lingered like a shadow. She had survived the arena only to succumb to the simplest of enemies, infection. In a cramped, overcrowded medical chamber, she drew her last breath, surrounded by the indifferent machinery of Roman captivity. Her death went largely unnoticed, unrecorded in the dramatic annals of the empire, and yet the faint trace of her life persisted. A single bronze tag, a scribe's ledger, and a few whispered recollections ensured that her existence, however fleeting, would someday be remembered. The lex captivity, the law banning the public distribution of female captives as rewards, became a subtle but revolutionary change. Its enforcement was uneven, imperfect, and often circumvented. Yet it marked the first time the empire formally recognized a limit. For the first time, the machinery of Rome had to acknowledge that there was a line, however faint, between absolute power and moral hazard. Maximus's choices inspired others. A junior gladiator, previously brutalized and resigned to the empire's whims, refused his reward in imitation of the hero who had quietly resisted. Trainers grumbled, officials scowled, but the precedent could not be erased. Even within the rigid hierarchy of the arena, an ember of human conscience now existed, a quiet rebellion against an institution that measured life in entertainment value. Historians centuries later would puzzle over the hypogeum chambers, the bronze tags, and the scribes' careful entries. Archaeological evidence unearthed in 2018 beneath the very floors of the Colosseum revealed the systematized cruelty in astonishing detail. Stone cells, iron rings, drainage channels, and scratch marks left by desperate hands. Pottery fragments indicated daily routines of forced labor, minimal sustenance, and meticulous records of captives. The empire's efficiency, its brutal order, was undeniable. And yet, in that well-documented system, small anomalies, like the choice of Maximus, hinted at the enduring human capacity for empathy. The story of Sabina, Camasiccus, and Maximus poses questions that echo through history. How far will an empire go to assert dominance? How easily can morality be buried beneath law and custom? And what remains when the machinery of power finally meets a spark of human conscience? Even today, tourists stand on the Colosseum's sun-baked sand, admiring the arches, the grandeur, the spectacle, and almost never consider the shadows beneath their feet. Beneath the layers of stone and sand lie the remnants of a civilization that mastered architecture, warfare, and entertainment, but also perfected cruelty and dehumanization. Sabina's story, hidden for centuries, reminds us that human suffering often remains invisible, even in the brightest monuments. Yet there is a flicker of hope. One gladiator's quiet resistance created a ripple, showing that even in the darkest machinery of empire, humanity can survive. Maximus's defiance did not overturn Rome, but it preserved a sliver of conscience in a system designed to extinguish it. It is a reminder that history is not only written in victories, territories, and statues. It is also written in small, courageous acts that resist oppression, even if they seem inconsequential.